Hello, this is Paul Leslie on Expanding Perceptions. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of talking to a really unique gentleman. Philip Carr-Gomm is my guest. And for those who aren't familiar with his work, he's a psychologist, an author, former head of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, an international spiritual organization that he headed from 1988 to 2020. Presently, he's a psychotherapist, a teacher of yoga nidra and mindfulness meditation. Has an amazing online school I recommend everyone check out called The Art of Living Well, where he has multiple courses that offer insights and combine a way to kind of understand yourself psychologically and spiritually. So, Philip, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I wanted to just jump into it with the idea of psychology and spirituality. We both have those backgrounds, and so much of psychology has been rather, how do I put this? Rather kind of rooted in a materialistic, behaviorism kind of way of
Mhm.
seeing people as of late. And sometimes it's tricky when you want to talk about those two worlds of psychology and spirituality. How have you come in your journey to approach both of those and then to hold both of those kind of in
Oh,
a
but
similar way?
yes, you're right. It can be quite tricky to bring them together, and more and more though, what I've found in over the last, I don't know, maybe over the last 10 years, and certainly in kind of an increasing pace, people are so much more open to br bringing in ideas from spirituality and combining them with psychological ideas. Thanks to the internet, I guess. Thanks, I suppose, to the kind of madness that we see in the world, that has been happening since, certainly the beginning of this century, the 21st century. People seem to be more open to them, so it's become easier. And I think, I suppose one can trace a number of factors that can be helpful in this. I mean, the advent of transpersonal psychology was hugely helpful, of course. And I used to see it, I have a kind of image that I think is quite helpful for understanding this, that if we look at psychology, you see how, Freud comes along and he says, hey, there are different parts of you. There's a gorilla in the basement and there's a schoolmistress in the attic, and so on. And, you start dialoguing with these different parts of the self, and then Adler comes along and says, well, there are other people outside the house, there are other people around, okay. So you start engaging in that relationship. And then Jung comes along and says, what about the collective? This whole city that you're living in, and this culture and all the rest of it. And then you got people like Assagioli, the psychosynthesis founder, who came along and said, yes, but what about the relationship with the divine as well? Then you had you had the eco-psychologists who came along and said, well, there are other things apart from humans, okay, and maybe they're important for our mental health and well-being and so on. So gradually, the different dialogues and relationships are being acknowledged and worked with and seen as part of the journey towards mental health. So it's become easier, over the years. And I think we've, another way of looking at is the biopsychosocial model. So, which I don't know how many of your viewers are within the field of therapy and psychology, but I would imagine quite a number of them. This is a common kind of lens that you would use to look at psychological issues and mental health and so on. But we now know that the eco perspective is important. Nature is incredibly important in our relationship with it, and spirituality is so important. So for me, the sort of model I hold is a biopsychosocial eco-spiritual model. It's too big a mouthful, I know, but that gives a feel for it, I guess.
Well, it's this almost a push for holism, kind of a
Mm,
holistic
yeah.
view, which for some reason has been so difficult for psychology to incorporate. And just looking at, as you say, the history, how each of us have a part of something, and then we bring it into to form this magnificent whole. But
Mm,
so much of psychology overall, I mean, there are spots like, psychosynthesis, Jungian thought, transpersonal. But really, when you look at the big spectrum of psychology, so much has really almost a denial of that spiritual side of a person, maybe even in some cases a disdain
mm.
for it. Your experience, I think, is so unique because not only were you, practicing a psychologist, therapist, but you're also involved with a, very renowned spiritual organization and ecological organization. How did you kind of blend those two realms of living, if you will, into your practice?
Well, for many years I didn't. I kept them separate. Um, or rather, to be more accurate, I think what I did is I took my training as a psychotherapist and a psychologist, and I brought that into the work I did in the Druid world, the kind of insights and kind of methods too. Methods of group working, sharing, those sorts of things. I was able to, so for me, the kind of the traffic was very much in the direction of bringing psychological insights into this spiritual group that I was working with. And when I was asked to lead the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, it was very much, a movement that had come out of in a way, the Victorian and pre-Victorian era of, the esoteric world. And it needed the kind of insights of psychology really to enliven it and kind of bring it up to date. So I did that for 30 years. I found it harder to move the traffic back in the other direction. What I mean by that is in my therapy practice, people would say, well, how do you bring the fact that you're a Druid into your therapy practice? And I would say, well, I don't. That's separate. You know, but it all really came together just a few years ago when I was invited by a clinical psychologist who came to see me and invited me onto a program working with people who had suffered from treatment-resistant depression and who were in an Imperial College trial using psilocybin to see if it could help them in their depression. And she was really interested in the way that our relationship with trees can actually help our mental well-being. And so she had devised a program of when people, because what basically happened is you had these clinical trials, and of course, I guess there's this massive kind of revolution going on in psychiatric medicine now with psychedelics, and in these clinical trials, what typically happens is you'll have 1 or 2 sessions before taking the dose with a therapist. Then you'll go on the trip. Very often people will have very profound transformational experiences, which are often very spiritual. And there's an interesting correlation between the degree to which people sense it as spiritual and meaningful and the degree to which it's helpful and therapeutic, which is interesting in itself, of course. And then they would have a couple of integration sessions afterwards, then it would be over. And so my colleague and now friend Rosalind Watts, the psychologist, she felt strongly that they needed more integration work. They needed more sessions of therapy. And so she began a program, but bringing in trees as a kind of structure to, or a metaphor or a way of working through the year, over the year, different trees. And also she was very interested in the eightfold wheel of the year, which is a kind of central model in Druidry, the solstices and the equinoxes, and about every 6 weeks there's this kind of festival that's kind of rooted, and you find it in Christianity, but it goes way back into the pre-Christian past as well. And so we've been working together with that with these clients for some time, and that's developed into a whole program now, beyond the clinical trial aftermath, as it were. And what I saw then was how ideas from spirituality and Druidry in particular, around trees and the seasonal cycle of the year, could really be helpful within a psychotherapeutic or psychological framework. So the last couple of years, I've been looking at precisely that flow the other way. How can these kind of spiritual perspectives and practices help people? And really, you can set that in the context of the movement of positive psychology, which is really young, isn't it? I suppose it's what, about 5, maybe 10 years old.
Yeah, maybe a decade, maybe 15 at the most, I think.
Maybe 15 at the most, yeah. And I love its origin story. I think I've got it right. I don't know if tell me if you think I've got it right. Is that Martin Seligman, who developed the learned helplessness theory of depression? He's mowing the lawn one day, and his daughter he finishes, walks away from the lawnmower, and his daughter says, "For somebody who spent their whole life trying to make people happy, you're a pretty miserable guy, aren't you?"
I
We
think
were
that's
talking
true.
about daughters earlier, weren't we? And it's like, and I can just so see that happening. When you have kids, how they're your most confronting kind of mirrors. And he sat down. He said, "My God, you're right. Yeah, I need to. What is happiness, and how do we get it, and what do we, So anyway, in positive psychology, they actively encourage people to take ideas from spiritual traditions and to turn them into interventions and methods that can be used for mental well-being. And of course, Buddhism has been kind of mined for that, hasn't it, with mindfulness and gratitude work and so on. So I thought, well, let's mine Druidism. Let's see what's it got there. And it has this work with trees. It has this 8-fold cycle that we can work with, and so on. So that's so this is just what's been preoccupying me for the last couple of years.
I think it's fascinating. And as you were talking about, the work with trees and the seasons, so much of depression, at least I've seen, is almost a feeling of disconnection. And I remember reading about certain psychologists who would study with different indigenous cultures. And when somebody was experiencing what we would call depression or even severe anxiety, as a community, tribally, they'd all come together and do certain dances, or, like everyone comes around and tells them what's wonderful about them, or they take them on some new pattern altering ritual. So in a way, it's like reconnecting them. And what you're saying is it's not just reconnecting, like, for example, a druid rejoining a druid group. It's actually reconnecting them with nature itself, which we have spent so much time over the last, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 years, unfortunately disconnecting ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I think connection as a kind of theme, as a way of looking at this is hugely important. Rosalind Watts has developed a model which she calls the ACER model, and it's an acronym. Psychologists love acronyms, don't they? So it's accept, connect, embody, and restore. And it's this sort of kind of program of accept, coming out of ACT therapy, just really accepting who you are in your life, and then forging those connections that have somehow got unplugged. And then really embodying them and feeling them in the body, and then restore, a way of kind of giving back to the world and working in the world.
That kind of leads me to ask, as being involved in Druidry and the organization for so many years, did you find that a lot of what people were looking for in that work was that sense of connection more so than over here in the States, we have saying Hollywood Buddhism. It's like
Yeah,
the LA's. It's just the cool thing to go and meditate for a little while. Whereas
yeah.
this organization that you're kind of oversaw, do you feel it was that desire to connect not only with the land but also with other people that shared the land, and was that healing?
Totally. And in fact, I had a very interesting experience. We have camps, and one year there were a couple of hundred people in the camp, and we would be sitting in a big circle, and I asked everybody why they were, just that very simple question, why they were here. Why have you come to camp on the land? And I had assumed that most people would say because they wanted to learn more about Druidry and do the rituals and the practices and the meditations or whatever. And to my astonishment, everybody to a person said they were here to connect with others, to be in community together, and to connect with nature. And so I think, yes, I think people are drawn not so much looking for knowledge and teachings, which again would be a natural thing. You would think that's what people want, but actually I think what they really deep down want is connection. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a thing over here called safe spaces that they're trying to put into universities where you can, go sit and talk with people who are like you and not be bothered with other people's opinions or anything like that. A little political correctness, but at the same time, I'm wondering if we as culture need a safe space in that, and that's what therapy is really. If you're with a good therapist, she or
That's
he's
true,
giving
isn't
you
it?
a safe space, right?
Yeah. Yeah, safe space, and then working with the relationship. It's relational, and you can trust this person, you can open up to them, you can share with them, and hopefully that gets replicated in other relationships, and that feeling of safety you can keep with you in some way. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, when people kind of to now, since you've kind of been bringing both the psychology and the spiritual together, seek you out now, whether for coaching, counseling, whatever, consulting, what do you find that they most want? We've talked about connection, but kind of in their own lives, are you finding a series of themes that come up that people are kind of seeking?
Well, it's difficult. These last few years have become so stressful, uh, with 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 the pandemic, and then followed on by the war in Ukraine now, and the economic kind of fallout of that. I think probably in Europe we're feeling it more than over in the States, because of our energy supplies. So much of it was coming from Russia and so on. So there's a lot of stress. So I think stress and anxiety is probably the main factor now that people are experiencing, which is why I became interested in embodied practices. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I started to study. I felt the need to bring the body more into my work. They talk about our work as being talking therapy, and but I think it's really important to work on the embodied aspect of this kind of transformational work that we're doing. And so I because I speak French, and I was married to a French lady for many years, and I spent a lot of time in France. I was familiar with a system called sophrology, which was developed about 60 years ago, and I, I found out more about it and decided to train in it. And it brings the spiritual and the psychological together too. It was developed by a psychiatrist who was also whose wife was a yoga teacher, and he traveled in India and was really interested in the value of spiritual work and meditation and so on. And he brought it together with a psychological understanding, and developed this kind of system which is really effective. And so I trained in that, and that's another place where I'm able to bring the psychological and the spiritual together in the same place, sort of anchored actually in the body itself, which is great.
And that's something that I think traditionally our culture has been very limited.
Mm,
This is more of a, I think since the 60s, maybe we started to see a little bit of that openness. I think we're obviously seeing it now with all the yoga, the mindfulness coming into therapy. But for a long time, there was almost a dismissiveness about the role of the body. It's kind of,
mm,
well, cognitive. It's your thoughts, your behavior. You do those, and that's true. It's part of it, but
mm,
not those unconscious processes being ignored. It's kind of like one therapist I was talking to one time told a client of his, well, you can either deal with it now or you're going to deal with it later. And
mm.
when it's in the body, it's going to be one or the other. It's not going to go
Yeah,
away, you know?
yeah, exactly. Uh, and I think when one can when one can work at both levels, the kind of cognitive level and the somatic level as well, then it can be very powerful.
Well, I want to ask you, so much of your work that I'm seeing is really not only just trying to help people connect to themselves, but also connect to the world around them. But you also have it seems like an under the surface mission, if we will, maybe not so under the surface, about helping people kind of live more magical lives.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so much of that term magic, I think, has been either misunderstood, again, dismissed, but just making your life, your daily life, a magical practice. If
Mm.
if somebody comes to you and says, Philip, will you kind of help me have a magical life? What are the kind of things you would do to kind of help that person along?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you. Yeah. Well, what I guess one way I might go with that is I might encourage them to think about times in their life which they could describe as magical. It might be the time when they fell in love, the time when they went traveling when they were young, and they had magical experiences. And then you start to extend that, and you realize that you can go to the theater, you can go to the to the an event, and there's something special about it. That's what's so intriguing about art, actually, is the way you can look at one painting. I remember, what's that famous one? They made a movie called the girl with the pearl earring. Do you remember that movie, Girl with the Pearl Earring? And it was a novel as well. And I was in the art gallery in The Hague in the Netherlands, and saw that painting. And it was so interesting because there were the room was full of painting, mugshots. What are they called? Portraits. That's right. They were full of portraits, Dutch portraits, famous one. And then you got to the girl with the pearl in the end, and there was something different about it. And I spent ages staring at it, and then just looking at the other painting there, and then looking at that one, and I couldn't figure it out. But for some reason, that's why it's famous, because it's just got something. And that's what magic is. Stephanie, my partner, and we were up at the Edinburgh Festival just a few weeks back, which is this huge cultural event, and like 3,000 performances over a month period up in Edinburgh, and the streets full of people, lots of stuff. So you see shows every day, and comedy and theatre and opera and musicals, and some of them were fabulous, and some of them weren't. And I didn't mind seeing the ones that weren't fabulous too, because we went, for instance, to a Gabriel Byrne, the actor who plays the therapist in that series, doesn't he? He did a one-man show that was magic. I mean, there was just something about it. Stephanie sitting next to me, she was crying, just crying in it, and the energy in the room was incredible. The next night you see something else, and it's kind of okay, and you think, what is it? And sometimes you can analyze it and critique it, and sometimes you just don't know there's something. So what I would do with the client then is I would say, okay, now let's see if there's ways. Most people think, you see, that those moments you can't manufacture them. It just happens. You just happen to feel great one day, you happen to go to a beautiful place, or you happen to fall in love. But I believe that you can actually help to encourage those moments. The peak experiences, if you like. That's another way of looking at it. Peak, you can encourage them, and we know now psychology can help us with that. There are ways, and so can spiritual understanding. So really, when in talking about leading a magical life, it's a question of saying, okay, maybe there are things I can do that actually make these experiences more frequent, and then we work on that basically. And so I have an online course called Lessons in Magic, which does exactly that. I mean, that's what it works with.
Yeah, and the idea that it's unique to each person. As you were saying that, I was remembering a colleague who's a little older than me who said that when he was about 18 years old, early to mid 70s, he somehow scored tickets to see Led Zeppelin. And he said, I was seated literally almost right in front of Jimmy Page. And for 2 hours, he said, I came out a transformed guy. He says, I didn't become a guitar player or a rock and roll musician, but something, they were on fire that night. And he says, it literally transformed me. I was different. And
Yeah.
that's something that's unexpected, but that's a different way, and that's unique to him. Whereas, my father would probably go to Led Zeppelin and complain the whole time it was too loud. What's up with the girls up on stage? A bunch of sissies. So
Yeah, that's right.
it's going to be
Absolutely.
different. So, but what kind of things should most people start to do in their daily life? Should they start to spot, talking about the body, how their body is reacting when they encourage these or encounter these magical experiences?
Well, one of the exercises that we have in sophrology, I mean, the kind of core or foundational exercise in sophrology is like a particular induction. And by induction, I mean, a way of dropping into dropping from, a beta's brainwave state to an alpha state, dropping down. And it's very clever because it's quite quick. And involves kind of tension in the body and relaxation, specific ways of kind of scrunching your muscles up and then releasing them and breathing, visualize it. But it means you drop pretty fast into this deeply relaxed state. And then in that state, you're invited to conjure up relive the experience. And you run through all the senses and make it as real as possible, just for a brief period of time, and then you let it go, and then you do a little breathing exercise thing, and then you do it again. You do it 3 times like that, and then you come out of it. So it takes about 10 minutes, the whole thing. So it's very brief, but it's lovely to see people coming out of it saying, oh, wow, that was strong. I didn't realize, that I could get that deep. And it's like a muscle, that the more you do it, the more that understanding we have that the nervous system can't distinguish between physical, reality and the imagination, which is why PTSD is so unpleasant for people. So as you start to strengthen this muscle, you start to get the physical effects, because of course, when we have these very highly pleasurable and pleasant experiences, our bodies change. And we start to feel that, and it builds up over time. I mean, that's one way we can work with that. And then there's a whole process you can do of learning to identify, getting clear about where you want to go in life, the standard kind of coaching stuff. But if you can imagine, there's kind of coaching things around goals and all the rest of it, but with this particular kind of perspective.
Well, this begs the question then, when did you realize, was it as an early age that you were destined to live a magical life, or is that something that you've also had to work on a lot over these years?
Well, that's an interesting way. I mean, on the one hand, I mean, the answer is yes to both. I was incredibly lucky because when I was very young, my dad ran a history magazine from home. And so there were always kind of interesting people coming to the house, interesting books and magazines lying around. And he knew that the guy who started the Buddhist Society in London, a man called Christmas Humphreys, and so on. And so when I was really young, when I was 11, I read a book called The Life of the Buddha, and it was a very lyrical work, very lyrically written. And I read it, and I thought, that ignited in me this sense of, well, this is the thing to aim for. I mean, this is the only game in town. I mean, gaining enlightenment must be the only sensible ambition to have. And so I was very lucky with that. And in the same year, I met somebody who would become my Druid teacher, because a friend of his ran a college in London, and he was also the head of the Druid order in London. And so I met him. And so when I was a bit later, when I was 16, I asked him if I could train with him. So on the one hand, the flame, as it were, was ignited from an early age. So I was very lucky in that respect. But the thing is, you see, is I think you have to work on it. It's not like you get kind of lit up once and that's it. It's a continual kind of reminding, because sometimes any of us on a spiritual path will say, well, why, I kind of know this stuff. Why should I read another poem by Rumi? Why should I have to meditate? Why should I have to do any of this stuff? Because I kind of know it. All life is one, and and so it's like, but the fact is, A, we forget, and B, we have to, it's like we constantly have to kind of just keep tacking. I suppose there's probably some sailing analogy that I don't know, but something about keeping on course.
Well, I think it's that's why they call it the practice, as opposed to the one time people who've gone what they call sometimes the Kundalini experience, where they have this one with everything, and then an hour later, when their kids are screaming from the other room and the phone's ringing and their boss is upset, it's kind of like, well, that was nice, but back to daily life, isn't it?
That's totally it. That's this whole integration experience with psychedelics, this sort of world I've found myself in the last couple of years, is, with what we work with people who've had these extraordinary insights and perspectives from having taken psychedelics. But then they drop back into their everyday life with the same partners, the same bosses and kids, and and have to somehow integrate it.
I think that integration is important in multiple contexts. I had a friend of mine who during the Vietnam War, he had been a UDT, which they now call the Navy SEALs. So he had all this combat and camaraderie. And then the war ends, he goes home, and next thing you know, a year later, he's in a motorcycle gang because, oh, they fight, it's camaraderie, and it's almost like he's trying to maintain a context at that time through his life. So there was not that integration. How do you take this traumatic kind of
intense
yeah,
experience?
yeah. When you get someone like that, I mean, how do you? I know it's a kind of overgeneralized question, but how do you work with folks who want to kind of exit and change those contexts?
I'm trying to think. That's a really interesting example. I don't think I have had an experience of quite such a sort of kind of dramatic change of context, but in a sense, what is really wonderful about us as human beings is the way that articulation and expression in and of itself can be healing. And of course we work with that all the time in therapy, so you can have a client who comes to see you and you say very little as the therapist, and they express themselves, and afterwards they say, oh, thank you so much, that was such a good session, I feel so much better. And it's because just in the act of speaking, something has shifted, you know. And so a great deal of this integration work and so on. I don't know how it happened with your friend with finding himself in the motorbike gang, but I would imagine that if he'd come out of the SEALs and come back to the States and he'd found a supportive group of men, if he joined a men's group that was really kind of strong and real and authentic, and he was able to express all his feelings about how he was missing that camaraderie and the kind of intensity of life that they had, and he might have been able to work through it without having to act it out, as it were, in the way he did.
That's kind of the thing, the acting out to kind of work through and he ended up leaving the gang and then going, the traditional route, college, career, and things like that. But in a way that it was kind of at least the way he described it, working those things out, because there's always more to the story, isn't there? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we could probably talk for about next 3 months, Philip, but I know your time is definitely precious. I'm really delighted to at least kind of started a dialogue on this on these topics. So before we go, can you let people know the best way if they want to find you and connect with you and the work that you're doing now?
Thank you. Well, two things. Every Monday I go live on YouTube and Facebook, and I just chat for 10 minutes or so and do a meditation for 10 minutes. It's just 20-30 minutes of and I take a topic that usually that touches upon both the spiritual and the psychological, and have a kind of conversation. I'm not giving a lecture or a talk, or I'm having a conversation, and there's usually live 300 to 500 people who show up, and there's some lovely contributions from people too, and then we meditate together, and then it's recorded and it's up there, and it's called Tea with a Druid, and it's so that's something that people might like. And then the other thing is my website. On my website, which is just my name, with I always forget if it's got the hyphen in it. I think it's Carr-Gomm .com. Yeah, it's CARR-GOMM.com. And there, you've got access. You can see lots of stuff. All my books and some videos and meditations and the courses that I do, the online courses. And there are the courses in sophrology and there are courses in magic, bringing magic into your life, and so on.
Well, I think the amount of things that you've created, I think, is impressive. But what has impressed me about getting to learn about you, Philip, is the level of care that you tend to put into what you offer to people. And I know you were running this large organization, building it up. Sometimes it's hard with any organization to have as much care because those can be kind of trying. But that's the feeling I get, and maybe that's part of your magical living, is that care you bring.
Well, thank you. I think care and love is such an important part of this work, because without it, it's soulless, and and if one works with that, then other people, the people, talking about the organization I run, the people drawn to it are just fabulous. There's such fabulous people involved in this work, thousands of them, to begin with, 35 years ago, there was just a few dozen. And now there are thousands, and we have these amazing meetings. And we had a big meeting in Glastonbury in June, and there were about 400 people, and some people had come over from the States, and we just had a lovely time, and great people, and Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our talk, and you're quite right. I feel like we could talk for hours together.
Yeah, and we may have to do that one day.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
you're in the UK, but you may be coming over here before I get over there. So there's always there's a nice cup of tea for you at my place. Come on, anytime.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Okay. Well, thank you so
Thank,
much, Philip. I appreciate it.
thank you.